Hello history lovers and welcome back to the channel. Today is part 3 of our exploration into the Flanders mare, Anne of Cleves. In the previous episodes I covered Anna's early life in Cleves and then her short tenure as Queen of England, so make sure you go check it out if you haven't already. On the 17th of July 1540, just days after Anne's marriage to the king had been annulled, Sir Thomas Wriothesley arrives at Richmond to formally disband the former Queen's household. Anne was appointed new officers and ladies. That included Catherine Bassett, the sister of Anne Bassett and daughter of Lady Lisle. Some people, however, remained in her service, such as her interpreter, Wymond Carew, and Martha Denny, who was previously in her household. Anne told Wriothesley that she would not favour her homeland of Cleves or her family over the king, and promised to let Henry see any of her letters that arrived from abroad, if he so wished, as proof of her loyalty to her ex-husband. Anne never missed an opportunity to prove to Henry that she was okay with the new situation. She appeared cheerful and wore new English-style dresses every day. Anne also found a new love of English food. There is no place like this England for feeding right well. Her banquets at Richmond became well known, and she often played hostess to guests from the court. When she wasn't hosting banquets, she was doing sports and recreation. Henry had a history of getting rid of those he no longer trusted, so this was a good way for Anne to keep her head down and to butter up the king, to make a request. Anne wrote to Henry asking permission to invite the Lady Elizabeth to visit her on occasion, saying that to have had her for a daughter would have been greater happiness to her than being queen. Henry granted the request, presumably as thanks for Anne's cooperation in the annulment of their marriage. Anne was charmed by Elizabeth's beauty and wit, and as a woman who had no desire to remarry, she channeled her maternal love and feelings onto her stepchildren, most notably the Lady Elizabeth, who she was very fond of. Elizabeth was much younger than Anne, unlike the Lady Mary, and she was never fussed over by a horde of governesses and nurses like Prince Edward. If Anne had any hopes of reconciling or getting her marriage back on track, they were swiftly dashed on the 28th of July 1540, when King Henry VIII wed for a 5th time to Anne's former lady-in-waiting, Catherine Howard. The same day that Thomas Cromwell, the man who had arranged Anne's marriage, was executed. Apart from Anne herself, it looked like Henry had done everything to distance himself from his previous marriage. On the 6th of August 1540, Henry, with a few attendants, rode to Richmond, where Anne was staying. The French ambassador Marillac wrote that they were on the best terms possible, and they supped so pleasantly together that some thought she was to be restored to her place. But this wasn't entirely true. The visit was mainly business, and to witness Anne sign a document that is thought to have been the deed of separation. In late October 1540, Anne of Cleves had become ill with an upset stomach, and as such, the Tudor rumour mill got to work, saying that the former queen was pregnant with the king's child. The king, upon hearing the news, ordered this to be investigated, to which it was found out to be nothing more than just a rumour. On the 3rd of January 1541, the new king and queen hosted New Year's celebrations at Hampton Court Palace. The Lady Mary had very little respect for her new stepmother, probably because Catherine was younger than Mary, and as such, their relationship was fairly strained. However, Anne of Cleves, now wielding her title as the king's sister, had a fairly good relationship with the king, the queen, and the Lady Mary, so she acted as a mediator between the two women. In fact, Anne's relationship with the king was so good that rumours swirled later that year, in early April, of Henry dumping Catherine and getting back with Anne, to the extent that Catherine sought reassurance from her husband. Not gonna lie, taking Henry's track record into account, he would probably be the last person that I was going to ask for reassurance. But anyway, Henry is said to have told Catherine that she had nothing to worry about.
You serious?
And that even if he had to choose another wife, he would not choose Anne. I mean, that bit was true. Anyway, Anne and Catherine danced the night away at Hampton Court, hours after Henry had gone to bed, and when Henry gave Catherine a ring and 2 small dogs as seasonal gifts, the Queen gave them to Lady Anne, and prior to the night at Hampton Court, Anne had sent the King and Queen 2 horses with violet velvet trappings. Early November saw the start of Catherine Howard's downfall, and with that, the rumour mill got going once again. And it was the same old rumour of the King taking back Anne as his Queen. But this time, France was in favour of the match. That's because since their marriage, King Francis had allied himself with the German princes, in hopes that if Anne and Henry got remarried, Henry would be a great ally against the Spanish. The rumours went from remarrying to Anne's had a baby. Not any baby though, but the King's baby.
Big blowing sack of drama say what?
Henry was understandably furious that no one from Anne's household had given him a heads up about this scandal. But I'm also like, Henry, why don't you just do the maths? Furthermore, Henry, why don't you just do the biology? If you two haven't consummated the marriage, no baby.
Pretty obvious.
So how did this rumour come about? Not long after the arrest of Queen Catherine Howard, Anne of Cleves was noted to have fallen ill. Some say it was after hearing about the news of the Queen. Others believe it was not an ailment, but more of a mental health issue. Either way, she was out of sorts. At this time, coincidentally, her favourite lady, Dorothy or Dorothea Wingfield, had just given birth to a new son, William. And I imagine that she might have brought the child to see Anne to help lift her spirits, which may have been a reason for the childbirth rumour. Elizabeth Bassett, who had replaced Dorothy while she was in labour/recovering, and Jane Ratesy were attending to Anne at the time. Alison Weir states in her book The 6 Wives of Henry VIII that on the 22nd of October, Henry VIII, while at the moor in Hertfordshire, was astonished to learn there was a rumour circulating that he had impregnated Lady Anne of Cleves, while he had visited her in Richmond in August. Henry was relieved to discover, after investigation, that Anne had been confined to her bed for only an upset stomach. Someone had suggested, and rumour had it, that it was morning sickness. Her Lady Jane must have mistaken Anne's sickness as morning sickness, as she was overheard saying, "It's God's working in his own way to make Milady Anne queen again." Anne was mortified at what her lady had just said, and firmly reprimanded Jane for her false statement, fully aware of the consequences. Anne's lady, Jane Ratesy, Elizabeth Bassett, and Dorothy Wingfield were closely questioned about the rumours. Now I just want to note that the sources I've used both mention that Jane was questioned, but one mentions Elizabeth and not Dorothy, and vice versa. So I just wanted to highlight that for clarity. Either way, Anne's ladies denied the rumours, and Henry was relieved, although he may not have been if he knew that both Jane and Dorothy were hoping that the downfall of Catherine Howard meant that their Lady Anne would be reinstated as queen. And they weren't the only ones. The Cleveland ambassador, Olislega, was also pushing for both Thomas Cranmer and the Earl of Southampton to try and influence the king to take Anne back as his queen. Even the French ambassador was asked to promote Anne's cause, but he wisely responded that it might be better to wait until Catherine Howard's fate had been determined before taking any action on Anne's behalf. Question is, was the Cleveland ambassador pushing for the reunion? Was he acting on the behalf of Anne herself? Or on the behalf of Anne's brother Wilhelm? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Marillac did not believe that the request came from Anne. He was more in the camp of the Cleveland ambassador. In early December of that year, the council wrote to Sir Anthony Browne, although the handwriting is thought to be that of Thomas Wriothesley. We examined also, partially before dinner and partially after, a new matter, that the Lady Anne of Cleves should be delivered of a fair boy, and whose it should be, but the King's Majesty, and gotten when she was at Hampton Court, which is most abnominal slander, and for this time and the case in as we think, most necessary to be met with all. This matter was told to Taverner of the Signet more than a fortnight ago, both by his mother-in-law, Lambert's wife, the goldsmith, and by Tavern's own wife, who says she heard it from Lilgrave's wife, and Lambert's wife also heard it from old Lady Carew. Taverner kept it, and they, with others, have made it a common matter of talk, and never revealed it till Sunday night, at which time he told it to Dr. Cox, to be further declared, if he thought good, who immediately disclosed it to me, the Lord Privy Seal. We have committed Taverner to the custody of me, the Bishop of Winchester, and Lambert's wife, who seems to have been a dunce in it, the Chancellor of Augmentatius. Just a day later, we discovered that Francis Lilgrave had indeed openly slandered Lady Anne, and spreading a rumour that she had had the king's baby son privately at one of her country houses. However, she couldn't, or wouldn't, name her sources. As a result, she was sent to the Tower of London along with Richard Taverner on the same charges. It appears Francis Lilgrave was a member of Anne's household, along with Jane Ratsey and Elizabeth Bassett. Question is, was there any substance to this, or was it just typical court gossip amongst the women? Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife and queen, was beheaded on the 13th of February 1542. Upon hearing the news of Catherine's fate, the Duke of Cleves hoped Henry would take back his sister. In the spring of 1542, he instructed his ambassadors to use their influence to promote a reconciliation. One German envoy visited Cranmer at Lambeth and directly asked him to facilitate this. When the king heard this from his archbishop, he instructed Cranmer to firmly inform the Duke of Cleves that there could never be a reconciliation between Anne and himself. That May saw a rumour of the failing health of Prince Edward. He was fine, but that didn't stop Parliament from trying to arrange another marriage for the king to produce the necessary spare. It was undeniable that there was a significant lack of suitable candidates for the vacant consort's throne. Most ladies viewed queenship as dangerously unstable, given the king's tendencies to either dismiss or execute his wives. He either putteth away or killeth his wives. It was generally agreed that any woman he married would need nerves of steel, sharp wits, and unquestionable virtue. Chapuis was of the view that Henry would choose his next wife, as, when he takes a fancy for a person or a thing, he goes the whole way. Enter Catherine Parr.
Hello there.
A woman who undeniably had nerves of steel, sharp wits, and unquestionable virtue. Any hope that Anne had of remarrying Henry evaporated on the 12th of July, 1543, when he wed for the final time to Catherine Parr at the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court Palace. Henry visited Anne at Richmond, and he informs the former queen himself that he had married Catherine Parr. Multiple sources say that Anne did not take this very well. Allegedly, pretty devastating and humiliating, especially as she thought that she was better looking than Catherine, a statement which none of the ambassadors who reported it denied. However, Alison Weir states quite the opposite. She showed not the slightest annoyance at her former husband uniting himself to another lady. Indeed, she seemed very pleased about it. A fine burden Madame Catherine has taken upon herself. This may have been after Anne had time to process the information. Chapuis reported that Anne was yearning to make a return to Cleves, as her mother, the Duchess Maria, was ill, and this news, that made certain that she would never remarry the king, must have been the last thing she wanted to hear. Anne's mother, Maria, died a month later. Okay, let's skip forward to the 28th of January 1547. At 2 o'clock in the morning, King Henry VIII yielded his spirit to Almighty God and departed this world, at the age of 55. Anne was informed of her ex-husband's death in early February. With Henry dead, Anne's stepson Edward assumes the throne as King Edward VI. The Lady Anne was now no longer the Queen's sister, and saw a decline in status. The new King's Privy Council saw Anne as a financial drain and an irrelevant relic from the previous king's reign. Anne would eventually have to give up 2 of the manors that Henry had given her. She established Hever Castle as a lively social centre where she regularly entertained. In March, rumours started about Anne potentially marrying the king's uncle, Thomas Seymour. Seymour bribed royal servant John Fowler to find out how Edward might take the news that he had proposed to Catherine Parr. When Fowler mentions that he was surprised that Thomas Seymour, the Lord Admiral, was not yet married, and if the king was happy for his uncle to marry, Edward responded with, "Yeah, very well." Fowler then asked, "Whom would your grace like him to marry?" Edward replied with, "My lady Anne of Cleves." Obviously, this was not the answer that Seymour and Fowler were looking for. However, Edward did also consider my sister Mary to turn her opinions. Thankfully, when Fowler asked the next evening if he should be contented to marry the Queen, the young boy king gave his approval. But this is another example of Catherine Parr being chosen over Anne on the marriage market. Although Catherine Parr would later die on the 7th of September 1548, and the idea of Thomas and Anne marrying did not resurface after her death, so I don't think either party was particularly keen. In 1548, Anne had to give Richmond Palace back to the crown, as Edward's council did not pay Anne the allowance that Henry had set up for her, so she couldn't afford its upkeep. Anne did not uphold the maintenance of Richmond Palace, to the point that the council were shocked at the state she had left it in. Anne did not see it as her responsibility to maintain her properties. 2 years later, the crown owed her so much money, she petitioned to her stepson, the king. Edward did get some of the money paid back to her, but she would never receive a full repayment. In 1552, Anne of Cleves once again complained and was granted various lands and manors to supplement her income. However, as she pointed out in a letter to her close friend, the Lady Mary, I was well contented to have continued without exchange, and had travailed to my great cost and charge almost this 12 months to that end. Anne of Cleves divided her time between Bletchingley in Surrey, Richmond Palace, prior to her handing it back to the crown, and Hever Castle. Anne was always welcomed at court, allowing her to enjoy the best of both worlds as an honorary member of the king's family and as a country gentlewoman. Thus she witnessed the shifting tides of power and the changing fortunes of the monarchy during the mid-16th century. She saw Edward VI decline in health and learned of his death from consumption at 15 in July 1553. Shortly after, she heard of Northumberland's plot to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. With sincere gladness, she learned how the country rallied to Mary Tudor's cause, leading to Mary's overthrow of Queen Jane and her own proclamation as Queen of England. During Queen Mary I's coronation in 1553, Anne and Elizabeth were accorded the place of honour at Mary's lavish coronation. The two women shared an open chariot directly behind the Queen, which was draped in a cloth of silver. Anne and her youngest stepdaughter were also given new dresses. They were both robed in crimson velvet, and in the procession to Westminster Abbey, they walked together directly behind the new Queen. The next day, Anne dined at Mary's table, following the coronation itself, again alongside Elizabeth. Even Mary's cousin, Lady Lennox, whom the Queen was particularly fond of, was not given this honour. During Edward's reign, a Protestant form of religion had become mandatory. While Mary had always refused to conform, there is no evidence that Anne did anything other than obey the law. Now, with Mary restoring the country to Catholicism, Anne conformed once again. There is no information about her personal religious views. She likely had a preference, but no desire to be a martyr. Her mother had been a conservative Catholic, but her sister Sybil was considered a leading light in the Lutheran world. Soon after Mary's accession, Anne requested that the government recognise her marriage to Henry VIII as valid. If granted, this would trigger the terms of the original marriage treaty, enabling her to return home with the status and wealth of a dowager queen. However, the annulment settlement specifically precluded her from going home. Discussions about Queen Mary finding a husband began. Anne felt confident enough in her relationship with Mary to join those advising the Queen about her marriage. Her preferred candidate, recommended by her brother, was Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, brother of Wilhelm's wife and son of Mary's cousin, the King of the Romans. However, Mary's engagement to her cousin Philip led to the Wyatt Rebellion in early 1554, which aimed to stop the marriage and potentially replace Mary with her half-sister Elizabeth, intending for Elizabeth to then marry Edward Courtenay. Mary believed that Anne was working against her. It is unlikely that Anne would have plotted against Mary in favour of Elizabeth for personal reasons, as there is no evidence of a quarrel between the two women. Reynard's suggestion that Anne sought revenge for her rejection by King Henry VIII also seems quite far-fetched, as neither Mary nor Elizabeth was responsible for it. A more plausible motive would be a general desire from Cleves to undermine the emperor, which Anne might have supported out of loyalty to her brother. There is no evidence that Anne was questioned about the rebellion. On the 3rd of April 1554, following Wyatt's defeat, Wilhelm sent a polite message of congratulations to Mary. Anne would receive devastating news later that spring of the deaths of her sister Sybil and her brother-in-law Johann Frederick. Out of her core family, only her, Wilhelm, and Amelia were left. It also seems that Anne had lost the Queen's friendship. Dissatisfaction over Anne's possible implication in the Wyatt Rebellion may have discouraged the Queen from reopening the question of the validity of Anne and Henry's marriage. When the Queen and her cousin Philip wed on the 25th of July 1554, Anne wrote from Hever to congratulate her stepdaughter on the marriage and ask, "When and where I shall wait on your Majesty and his." She had not been invited to the wedding, possibly because Mary still had a lingering suspicion of her stepmother. Despite asking for permission to visit the Queen and her new husband, there is no evidence that Mary invited Anne to court again. Anne wished that the couple should both enjoy much joy and felicity, with increase of children to God's glory and the preservation of your prosperous estates. By the 1550s, Anne of Cleves had converted to Catholicism, influenced by Queen Mary I. During the Inquisition in England, Anne rarely appeared at court, preferring the life of a private gentlewoman, attending to the domestic affairs and managing her estates. The rents from her estates allowed her to live comfortably, and her steward, Sir Thomas Cordon, formerly Henry VIII's Master of Revels, assisted her so ably that she bequeathed him her manor of Bletchingley as a reward when she died. Anne never remarried or left England. With her parents deceased and her brother, a strict Protestant, disapproving of her conversion, returning to Cleves was out of the question. She had grown fond of England and its people, intending to die in her adoptive land. In her later years, when her health began to fail, Queen Mary allowed her to live at Chelsea Old Manor, where Catherine Parr had once lived with Lord Admiral Thomas Seymour. It was here at the Chelsea Old Manor, in mid-July 1557, that Anne dictated her will. She left a diamond ring to her brother and a ruby ring to his wife. Another diamond ring went to her sister, Lady Amelia, as well as to the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, Catherine Willoughby. The Lady Elizabeth was to receive Anne's second best jewel, while her best jewel was bequeathed to the Queen. Knowing she was dying, Anne ended her will with the request that all beneficiaries pray for her soul and ensure that her body was buried according to the Queen's will and pleasure, and that she might receive the last rites of Holy Church according to the Catholic faith, wherein we end our life in this transitory world. On the 16th of July 1557, Anne of Cleves died at Chelsea. By the Queen's order, she was buried with great ceremony in Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of August 1557. Members of Anne's household carried her banners aloft and walked in the procession. At Charing Cross, the cortege was met by 100 more of Anne's servants, all bearing torches, who joined the throng of mourners. Her ladies, clad in black and mounted on horses, were also present, along with 12 bedesmen of Westminster and 8 heralds bearing white banners of arms, who surrounded the corpse. At the abbey door, everyone dismounted, and the Bishop of London, along with the Abbot of Westminster, received the body, swinging incense over it. The chief officers of Anne's household then came forward, broke their staves of office, and cast them after the coffin. Jane Seymour's sister, Elizabeth, Marchioness of Winchester, was the chief mourner, and led the ladies in making their offerings afterward. Mary ordered that Anne's funeral be conducted with all the ceremony due to a woman of such a high rank. Anne was the last Queen Consort of England to be buried in a Catholic ceremony. And that's where I'm going to leave today's video. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Anne of Cleves, then make sure you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, have a wonderful day.